All right, I want to introduce you to Olga Oliker, who is the International Crisis Group's Program Director for Europe and Central Asia. And as I look back, Olga, you've been doing this for quite some time. You know these issues very, very well. So let's just jump right to some 90,000 troops, Russian troops on the border with Ukraine. What is President Putin doing? Is he bluffing?
So there are always a lot of troops near the border with Ukraine, and especially since Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, it really built up the Black Sea Fleet that had already been, Russia's Black Sea Fleet had already been based in Crimea even before the annexation. So there's been a buildup. So there's usually a lot of Russian troops near the border with Ukraine.
But not that many.
There are more now. And they've been moving around in ways that make everybody a little bit nervous or a lot nervous. So the question on everyone's minds is, are they preparing to attack? Are they bluffing? Are they trying to make everybody nervous? If they do attack, is it going to be the big attack that Ukrainian military intelligence has talked about, or something smaller? What's going on? And the answer might just be that the Russians haven't decided yet themselves, and they're keeping their options open.
The Russian ambassador to the UK just warned over the weekend of a serious risk of war as Britain deployed some of its armor back to Germany, fearing that there may be an escalation of violence there. The State Department, the White House are all, warning their European allies that war may be in January or February. So it certainly seems like people in the intelligence community believe that Putin's about to make a move.
Or that he might be, right? I mean, look, and there's also this mutual deterrence, coercion activity going on, right? Look, the Russians' hope is surely that they can get what they want without a war. What do they want? They want Ukraine to be a more amenable Ukraine. They want a promise from the West of no NATO or EU membership for Ukraine. They want to renegotiate the whole European security order. All of, this is a big ask. In the near term, they just want the Ukrainians to, be a lot more amenable to there's been a real standstill in progress on implementing the Minsk agreements that ended the really high-end fighting in 2014 and 2015. The Russians are trying to push something. I think the problem here is that they are probably willing to go to war to get that. They've proven that they're willing to go to war in the past. They'd probably prefer not to. Western states would prefer that the Russians back off and not get what they want. So you've got this kind of jockeying for position. The Western states are also probably not that interested in fighting Russia. The question is, would they if push came to shove?
Okay, let's come back to that, because that's really critical. But the Russians want to get what they want. So right now, there is no pending EU membership on anybody's doorstep. There is no pending NATO membership on anyone's doorstep. So it seems, so what do they want right now? Putin says they want Ukraine to implement the Minsk agreements.
So the Minsk agreements are two sets of agreements that were signed in 2014 and 2015 to effectively end the really, really bloody fighting that was going on at both of those points in time. They are, like many peace deals, they favor the forces that were winning at the time, and those were the separatist Russia-backed and the Russian forces that were actually helping them out. Ukraine signed these deals because it really couldn't afford to keep losing, which means that.
But why does Putin want them implemented so quickly? I mean, the Ukrainians have not implemented the sections of the Minsk agreements which allow for free elections and, more promised autonomy in the Donetsk region, because they say that Russia hasn't stopped supplying arms. Russia hasn't stopped the fighting. Russia needs to get out of there, which Russia denies they're even there. But Russia needs to get out of there before you hold any democratic elections in the Donetsk region.
Right. I mean, how free could elections be if they're held under the control of these people who've been running these regions since 2014, these self-proclaimed heads of the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic. The thing is that, and there's these interpretations of what special status means. For the Russians, the vision is that special status is going to give these regions, led by the people that they're supporting, a veto over major Ukrainian policy decisions, including foreign policy. Now, whether that
which is a veto over NATO membership, which is a veto over joining the EU.
Yeah, I mean, look, interestingly, Ukraine had a neutrality clause in its constitution before 2014. So it's, you know, people change their minds. People, you know, you can get all sorts of promises out of a country and then that shifts. So it's, you know, I have some questions about how effective this would be in the long term, even if Russia got exactly what it wanted. But nonetheless, what the Russians want is some progress on all of this. The conventional wisdom before spring of this year was that everybody was okay with the status quo, that Russia was kept Ukraine sort of on edge, that the Ukrainians, you know, weren't happy with this war in the East, but they also had no plan to integrate these regions. And this kept the West on their side, so it was okay with everybody.
But what happened?
But talking to Russians about this, the sense you get is they'd really expected Vladimir Zelensky, who came to office as president of Ukraine in 2019, to cut some deals, to make some progress on Minsk, to start giving them what they wanted. That they really do want progress on this, because in the meantime, what they're seeing is a Ukraine that's getting closer and closer to NATO and the EU, even if membership isn't in the cards. And one of the things that Vladimir Putin said in Sochi recently is that, you know, it doesn't have to be NATO membership, it's this infrastructure. You know, the NATO alliance has no NATO infrastructure in Ukraine, right? It's member states doing a training mission here or there, it's things like that. But what Putin's saying is, I don't care. All of this, my red line isn't NATO membership. My red line is this relationship that's developing between Ukraine and NATO, Ukraine and the EU.
Let's spin the wheels back to what you said a few minutes ago. Would the West defend Ukraine? Would NATO countries defend Ukraine?
So Russia is probably counting on that answer to that question being no. And that is why Russia is probably prepared to escalate. I think some NATO countries might be inclined. It really depends on how it all plays out and what the circumstances are and what kind of conflict it is and how quickly things move. And I think this is the real challenge for Western countries, is they want to deter Russia. But it's hard to deter Russia if there are such clear limits to what you will do. And one of the problems here is that you make all of these statements about ironclad commitments and promises. You can box yourself into a corner where it's the worst of all possible worlds. You've sent Russia the signal that you wouldn't fight, but then you feel that you might actually have to do more than you've said you would when push comes to shove. And that's where you get the escalation nobody wanted, without having deterred, which you might have if you'd actually signaled you would do it.
Seems to me you're saying if there was a slow roll, if that fighting started and Ukraine could hold out for some time, that the West would, through NATO, through other organizations, support Ukraine and support them defending themselves.
We're not through NATO, through individual countries, through, you know, what we saw in 2014 was each different countries doing kind of their own thing at varying degrees of just how much help they were going to give. Most of that, you know, all of it was some supplies and some training. You know, there's really no amount of supplies and training you're going to give the Ukrainians right now. It's going to enable them to withstand Russia on their own. Russia it has more, it has better capable forces. Ukraine has good forces. Ukraine actually has good equipment. They're a major arms exporter. They've been building weapons for a long time. There's something a little bit strange about saying we're going to send an EU military training mission to Ukraine. I mean, these guys have been fighting the Russians for 7 years. The EU is going to send a military training mission? I mean, the EU has not been fighting the Russians for 7 years. So a lot of this is very symbolic. What actually happens if push comes to shove, you know, some countries, particularly countries that are closer to Ukraine, that are more fearful of Russia, might be inclined to help more. And then, you know, what does the rest of NATO do? Well, I don't think the rest of NATO censures them for it, right? Maybe you don't need all of NATO to do something, but then you do effectively have a conflict between NATO and Russia once NATO member states are involved. And if Russia moves against those NATO member states in any way, you start getting into Article 5 territory. I mean, this is how the escalation story can work. If I want to spin out that story, it's a pretty scary story. I would say it's a pretty scary story if you're in Moscow too.
What do you make of President Zelensky's comments in the last week that there's an assassination plot involving the Russians against him, a coup d'etat, which he has uncovered.
I have no idea. I have not seen any of the evidence.
Nobody has.
Nobody has. Well, Vladimir Zelensky says that he has, so presumably somebody showed it to him. Look, the Russians are sick of Zelensky. I mean, that's certainly the messaging that we've heard from them. And I've heard, and I've read, and you see this Russian narrative that they would like somebody else in power in Ukraine. It is hard to imagine them getting somebody who is actually more favorable than Zelensky. But that's, countries aren't always realistic.
Is Zelensky a strong leader, do you think? I mean, Poroshenko, I think that, his predecessor would probably command the troops to defend against a Russian attack and do so in the most vigorous way he could. Zelensky?
So look, I think the Ukrainian forces will fight. And I don't think that has very much to do with who is at the helm of the government and how they feel about that person. If they feel, if they are under attack, they will fight. They've proven this before, and the people of Ukraine will fight. I don't have any question of that. The positions on Russia have hardened, not softened, over the last 7 years. It's, I think there's a myth in Russia that there's a silent majority in Ukraine that actually loves Russia. This is not true. I mean, I think that myth exists in part because the only Ukrainians one interacts with in Russia are people who like Russia, who travel to Russia, because Russian men can't even travel to Ukraine right now.
You don't think that there's a softer, more pro-Russian or possibly a little more neutral population segment as you look kind of around the Crimea, down that Black Sea coast?
Look, Crimea is in Russia, and I don't have evidence to suggest, while the population is probably divided on the subject, most of them are probably okay with being in Russia. I have not done the public opinion polling, but,
I've been there, and I know they were very pro-Russian, and
that is the case.
Yeah.
But one thing I've seen traveling to Eastern Ukraine since 2014 is you've seen in Eastern Ukraine, where the attitudes were much more friendly towards Russia, you've seen a shift. You've seen far more people speaking Ukrainian. You've seen this patriotic nationalism grow. And even people who speak Russian, who continue to speak Russian, they don't want to live in Russia. They don't want to be Russian. And I've had this conversation with Russian colleagues, and they say, well, it's the Ukrainians you speak to, which my answer is, look, I don't speak Ukrainian. When waiters at restaurants, when cab drivers, so forth, are speaking Ukrainian to me, I don't understand them. They're not doing it to impress me. So there is something going on here.
Well, I guess we see how it plays out. The question is the West making a mistake right now by wagging its finger and saying, don't you dare, Vladimir Putin, you will pay a severe price. And that's coming from the White House. It's coming from NATO, Stoltenberg, everybody. But, should there be another approach to this? And a lot of people think that the only approach that you could take to dissuade Putin would to make promises of no NATO membership. And nobody's going to do that.
Right. So, what the Russians are asking for from both Ukraine and the United States is both impossible and probably going to be insufficient for them, right? Because we've seen promises made before that get walked back, like the neutrality clause that used to be in Ukraine's constitution. So I don't see how that's going to solve the problem. It's not going to be sufficient. I think the real problem with the finger wagging is insofar as they're not sending clear enough signals. The signal they end up sending is we will go so far and not further. And so far and not further is not going to deter. And if you're trying to rely on strategic ambiguity, if you're trying to rely on this idea that, well, maybe it'll be much worse, well, the Russians are willing to escalate. The Russians are pretty sure they're more willing to escalate than Western countries are. And they think the Ukrainians are weaker and that taking and occupying parts of Ukraine will be easier than they probably will be. So put these things together and you have a problem.